Here we go. So thank you all for showing up for this informational. Again, my name is Ricky Frierson, the Director of Diversity and Inclusion for Warner College. Today we have a special guest, Lee Tyson, who's a research analyst for institutional research, effectiveness, and design. And what she'll be talking about today is her title message will be looking at the data, Warner data, and how it affects minoritized students within WCNR. And I'm looking forward to this conversation in which the data she's going to share with us. And so as we're listening to her presentation, first and foremost, I want to make sure that everyone, please save any comments or questions to the end. You can write your questions in the chat box as she's presenting, and I'll do my best to bring those questions towards Lee at the end of the session. This session will be recorded for those colleagues who are not able to come today. We will make sure that you have a recorded copy of this. Likewise, because of that, I'm also going to put in our chat right now, as you just see, our website. And within that, you will see a tab in which we will start to have a training library for Warner College around these different issues. And so when these particular sessions or informationals come about, you will see a tab within the Warner website where it will say trainings. Such as ones today that will be recorded. So you can go back and look at previous trainings from this past spring, trainings from earlier this summer, and then trainings to go forward as well, so we can continue to build an extensive dialogue. Likewise, I want to make a formal announcement that next Monday, on July 6th, I will be participating in an event called Civil Behaviors with Community and Police. And with that, that is hosted by the Fort Collins Rotary Club, and a member of that club is Dale Benson, who is part of FWCNB. But I'll be having a conversation with the chief, the city police chief, about civil behaviors and responses on better policing with minoritized communities. So if you feel like that's something that you want to partake in or listen to that conversation or even just give me support, feel free to do that. I will post that at the same time I give out the training the training video for today. I will post that all in the same email with the link and everything, no later than Thursday. So just be looking out for that as well. So this Monday coming up from 9:30 to 10:30, it'll be a Zoom meeting as well. I'll be having a conversation with the chief of police about civil behaviors with community and police. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Lee to present her information and data. And like I said before, if you have questions, please put those questions in the chat box, and I will do my best to follow those up at the end of the presentation. Lee, we can take questions at the end, so that way you go all the way through, and then we can address the appropriate questions at the time. Okay, so without further ado, I will black out my screen and let Lee take it from here.
All right, well, thank you for inviting me, Ricky. I really appreciate this. Can you see these slides up? Just a compilation of IR data?
Yes.
Okay, great. So, so Ricky invited me to kind of talk about racially minoritized students in Warner. And so I've kind of picked through a number of data sources that institutional research has available to kind of look at some of these this information. So first, I'm just going to start with just an overview of some of the data available to you through IR's interactive website. And so that you can find enrollment information, degrees, some persistence rates, and graduation rates. And so we're going to take a look at some of that information just to kind of get a quick view of sort of the college. So a lot of this might be familiar, or some might be familiar information for you. And then I'm going to go get into I'm going to highlight 4 reports that we've done recently. I want to say within the last year, possibly the last 6 months. So this is all relatively new data that we're looking at for some key information related to racially minoritized students and student success. And so we're going to go through some of these reports, just highlighting some of the information for you. So we're going to quickly look at some of the information here available at our interactive website. For anyone who wants to kind of tinker with the website, if you have not, I'll put a link in the chat if I can find it. For anyone who might want to pop this open and take a quick look, at some of the data that are available to you from our website. It's all it's all self-service, and you can use the various filters. And so what I've pulled here is just some enrollment and some degree information here on Warner, looking at the enrollment of students for all undergraduate students. And you can see here we've highlighted in the blue line the Warner racially minoritized proportion of your enrollment compared to the university overall. And this is just kind of to get a sense of how things are tracking. And so what I'm seeing here is that the racially minoritized enrollment in Warner has been kind of flat for these last few terms, these last 3 years, despite an overall increase. And it's actually not, it's at a lower rate than what we see at the university overall. So that's what I'm seeing here. And then when we look at the degrees, we can see that of the degrees that are being awarded in Warner, and again, these are only primary degree majors, just breaking out minoritized versus non-minoritized, we can kind of see what proportion of minoritized students are earning degrees. And we're seeing this big jump here in 2018 2019, going from 11% up to 19% to almost right at that university, overall university level. So I thought this was kind of interesting to look at, but also thinking about sort of how the rates might be a little bit different between the college and the university overall, and thinking about sort of, especially this difference in the growth in enrollment, but then the minoritized students remaining kind of flat. And what does that sort of mean for attracting racially minoritized students to the college? So just something to kind of think about there. And then we also, moving on to some of our more common student success metrics, we're looking at second fall persistence for that first time full-time cohort, both within CSU and also with Warner. Generally what I'm seeing here is, again, there's some volatility, but I think that's because we have some there's some small numbers here, so I would expect to see that kind of volatility. When I look at these overall rates here, for comparison, the persistence rate, the second fall persistence rate at the university level for racially minoritized students is in the mid to low 80s. So we can kind of see there's some jumping here in Warner. And then in the college, it averages around 60% for racially minoritized students at the university level. So just thinking about where some of these differences might be. Now we're also looking at some of the graduation rates as well here. So again, minoritized versus non-minoritized, we can kind of see where we're seeing some differences, so some of those gaps in the 6-year graduation, and just thinking about what are some of the things that we could be doing to try to close some of those gaps that we're seeing within CSUs and also within Warner. I know that there is some concern with a lot of internal transfers. So again, we pulled some special data here. So far everything has been available in IR's interactive pages. Let's go to the junior cohort. So now we're looking at students that once they become a junior, based off of their credit, based off the number of credits earned, of those students who now are within Warner, and actually let me just we can kind of see the difference in the head counts here, where for that first time full-time cohort, you were at about 170 students, but by that junior cohort, we're seeing quite a bit of a jump in students within Warner once we hit that junior cohort. Now we're up to, for the fall 13, we're up about 300 students here. So, so I do think there is some movement, some internal movement between that first time full-time cohort and once we get to that junior cohort. So when we look here at that kind of 6-year graduation, again, we're still seeing some small gaps within these graduation rates for the minoritized versus non-minoritized students. So just some quick data here to kind of look at what we're seeing within Warner. So here's a quick report that we just did. And it's observed versus predicted persistence and graduation rates. I can bring a link, I'm gonna post a link here to the full report. that's available on our website. This is in our section on research briefs, and that will have a lot more detail about the methodology and sort of what we've done. And I pulled out some of Warner's information specifically. So the purpose of this study was really to kind of highlight the observed rates that we see, and then compare that to, based off of some regression modeling, what would be a predicted rate. And now is a particular department, again, this is at the department level, is it kind of performing higher or lower than what we would predict? And the overall goal of this report is to kind of encourage conversations between between departments about what activities might be contributing to these differences in what we're seeing versus what we're predicting, whether or not you're higher or lower. So again, we just did some quick regression modeling here. This is based off of the full university. And again, we're predicting two things: second fall persistence, and that's off of that fall 16 to fall 18 first time full-time cohort. And then for the 6-year graduation, we went back to that junior cohort, because again, we hope that sort of accounts for some of that internal transfers and sort of found major philosophy that we're seeing. And especially since we saw that big jump previously, I think that's a really good method for a really good metric here for Warner. Since I do think there is quite a lot of internal transferring kind of happening here within the college. So this is just a summary of the model here. I think the report might have some more detail on the modeling, but these are just the odds ratios that we're seeing. And so I personally find odds ratios kind of challenging to interpret without this other kind of context of the predicted probabilities. And so that's just taking that regression model and kind of converting it to those predicted probabilities to kind of understand that. So when we look at second fall persistence for racially minoritized students in Warner, we're seeing almost equal odds, if not slightly higher odds, for racially minoritized students for their second fall persistence. When we get to that 6-year graduation, we're seeing lower odds for racially minoritized students to graduate within 6 years. And so when we kind of convert that model, those odds ratios and everything into predicted probabilities, we can see here that predicted minoritized students and non-minoritized students, they're really going to persist at about 91%. When we get to the 6-year graduation, we see that difference here of 84% for the minoritized students and 92% for the non-minoritized students. So that's just kind of one way to think about these sort of modeling, what we would expect to see or what we're predicting based off of the data that we have. So then this is a table from the report, and this just gives you a quick kind of overview of, again, because the data were by department here, we're showing sort of the head count that was included. Again, we only did the modeling for departments that had over 200 students in them. So geosciences, unfortunately for the second fall persistence, did not get a model here. And so we kind of look, oops, let me go back down. So when we look at the observed persistence compared to the predicted persistence, we show the percentage point gap, but then we're also showing the upper and lower bounds for those predicted values. And so a department is going to be highlighted green if their observed persistence is outside of, excuse me, outside of those bounds that we predicted. And so you can kind of see here, some of these are just barely outside of these bounds. So it's just something to think about. And I know a lot of these departments, especially geosciences, have some really difficult math courses. So these are some very hard courses for students. Again, this is looking at overall students, not necessarily racially minoritized, but this just kind of gives you a sense of what's in that report. And if we want to kind of dig a little bit deeper, we can. The next report I want to talk about is this momentum year behaviors and student success. And I can link the full report for you as well, for anyone who wants to pull that up. And again, in our detailed report, in the full report, you can see the methods, and there'll be generally a lot of tables at the end of those reports that break down a lot of the data by various population subgroups, whether it's, first gen, Pell, racially minoritized, oftentimes we'll break it down by college as well. So if you're not familiar with Momentum Year is this part of this Complete College America's National Momentum Pathways project. And so they have 4 or 5 kind of benchmarks that they consider these key milestones for students to complete within their first year that in a way is that they're going to build momentum and propel them into their second year of college. And so we're looking at, so the state joined this project, and so part of evaluating this, we decided to look at 3 of those indicators that we have readily available to us, the data we have readily available to us. It's going to be the completion of 30 credits, completion of any math and English, and for our purposes that was Comp 150 or Comp 130 for this study. So the key findings that we found from this report is that really the biggest factor in sort of helping maintain sort of the highest persistence rates was for students who kind of completed 30 credits, whether that was alone or in combination with completing composition or completing math. So whether it was alone or in combination, they have much higher retention rates coming back for that second fall. Those who don't complete 30 credits, they have about 5 percentage point lower retention rates than those who do complete the 30 credits. And so when we started looking at the data, breaking it down by subgroups, we found that first generation, Pell recipients, and racially minoritized students, or those with remediation flags, were a little bit less likely to complete 30 credits, but the overall association was still very strong, that those who did complete even though they may have been completing 30 credits and some of these other benchmarks at a lower rate, that association of a higher retention rate was still there. And that pattern actually was consistent across all the colleges once we started looking at it. So we also did some modeling as well to kind of take a look at it. And we controlled for these variables here, which are pretty standard for us. We are moving, just as a side note, instead of index, we are moving more towards high school GPA because index was retired by the state. So that's one thing we're going to start doing more of a modeling with GPA. And you'll probably see a mix of index or GPA within some of these models. So this chart on the right here is just kind of just give you a sense of how the second fall persistence rate increased based off of how many of these momentum year criteria students completed. So if they don't complete any criteria, if they don't do any of these things, it's much lower retention, chances of retention than if they even just complete 1 versus 2 or all 3. And just as a side note, because we wanted to include students, I'm sorry, I'm a little distracted. Because we wanted to make sure, we only included students who persisted to the end of their first academic year. So that's also including the summer term, because again, we want this to be across the entire academic year for these students. So this retention rate here that you're seeing of the 90.3% is a little bit higher than what you would see in our published rates. So we also did a model for individual colleges. And so here's Warner's model that we can see up here. And so I've also plotted here on the right sort of that predicted second fall persistence based off of this model for minoritized and non-minoritized students. And so when we see here, when we look at that odds ratio for racially minoritized students, slightly higher than non-minoritized students. So we would expect them to, holding all things constant, and just that difference between minoritized versus non-minoritized status, we would expect racially minoritized students to persist at a slightly higher rate. And so this is what we're seeing here in this plot. And just kind of highlighted in that background here is just the overall CSU model, and we can see how it's very consistent across these groups. And so this just gives you a sense of to what extent the minoritized versus non-minoritized students are kind of completing these criteria and sort of what that profile of the students look like in these models and in these data that we're looking at. I can see that there's, you know, slightly high representation of first generation and Pell recipients in minoritized students. And also when we look at some of these momentum year criteria, we can see that minoritized students were more likely to complete just composition and just complete their English course versus the non-minoritized students. And so we can kind of see what some of these differences are. What I see here too, though, is that the completing of the 30+ credits was a little bit lower than I would have thought in Warner. So it's about almost 2/3 of Warner students did not complete 30 credits in that first year. So that takes into account the composition only, math only, and then comp and math. So that's almost 2/3 of students right there who didn't complete 30 credits. And so thinking about the importance of being able to complete 30 credits and having that higher persistence rate, that's something that we might want to think about how we can kind of help students complete those 30 credits. And I bring that up because we also, and I'm not going to go over this report either, but there is the potential for summer session really to kind of help boost students get into that 30 credits. If they can't do it in the fall and spring, if they can maybe take a summer course to help boost them into that 30 credit range, then they're much more likely to kind of persist. I believe there is some modeling about that in that overall report that you can kind of take a look at. So I think there's potentially something we can think about there in terms of helping students get to that 30 credit milestone. The next thing I kind of want to talk about, and I don't know how often we really talk about the financial support for students. I know it's very important. We talk about how can we academically support students, but how does financial aid play into student success? And so this is a study that we did with the Office of Financial Aid, and we looked at how financial aid was awarded, and we grouped students into these 5 income groups. So we have our limited income groups. So those are going to be the students with the highest financial need. They're generally our Pell recipients, but they're also all of our asset students who do have tend to have a high financial need, but are not eligible to complete the FAFSA. So therefore are not eligible for Pell monies. So their dollars are kind of made up through institutional support. We also have another group of students called the other need-based needs students, and we can kind of operationalize them as the lower middle income group of students who they have financial need, but they basically make too much money. They have too much money to qualify for Pell. So they're outside of the Pell grant limit, but still have some financial need. And then we also have some non-need-based aid students, no gift aid, and the no FAFSA students. Those students, they didn't receive any aid, so they are 100% responsible for their cost of attendance at college. And so the chart on the right here kind of shows you sort of the breakdown of how the profile of those income groups compare within Warner and CSU. And they're fairly similar, except for maybe in the non-need-based aid and the no gift aid group. There's a little bit of a difference there between Warner and CSU. But I don't want to get us too caught up in some of this financial stuff based for Warner, because that's just not how financial aid is awarded. There's not different policies based off of what college you're attending, but I just kind of want us to think about, when we support students, how can we support them potentially financially? Is there something that we can be doing here? So this is the profile of students by these income groups. You're seeing the overall, and these little call out boxes are just sort of how Warner sort of compares. And you're kind of similar, although here I found it really interesting that in your limited income group, your racially minoritized students are only 23% in the limited income group compared to almost 50% at the university level. So I thought that was kind of interesting and jumped out at me. So as part of this study, we wanted to kind of find a way to, how can we figure out financial aid and the level of support for a student, how does that kind of help with their success? So we came up with this metric called a net cost ratio, which is where we take the cost of attendance, subtract out any gift aid that a student receives, so any free money they don't have to pay back, and divide that by the original cost of attendance. So we end up with this ratio of that basically tells us that this student is responsible for 70% of their cost of attendance or 40% of their cost of attendance, depending on sort of what their income group is. And so we can see that, you know, our limited income group, their net cost ratio is averaging about 0.4. So they're responsible for 40% of their cost of attendance, meaning through grants and other institutional aid, free money, they were able to cover about 60% of their cost of attendance. So when we start looking at that cost of attendance by second fall persistence, we saw a pretty interesting pattern here where the higher the cost of attendance, it tended to show a lower persistence rate. And so if we want to think about equitable outcomes for our students, we're kind of want to target this sort of, if we think about the overall persistence rate is about 85%. When we start looking at some of these limited income students, we can kind of see that they drop below that 85% persistence rate once their cost of attendance goes above 0.4. So once they're responsible for more than 40% of their cost of attendance, they're less likely to be retained. And I also threw in a quick line here for Warner for the limited income group. Granted, it's a small group, so we are seeing some volatility here in terms of that line kind of jumping around. But I do think that we do sort of see that similar sort of pattern that where the higher that net cost ratio, the less likely a student is to be retained. We also did some quick modeling of this as well, throwing each one of these income groups in and sort of seeing to try to come up with what would be an ideal net cost ratio that we could attribute to a particular income group that would sort of help promote that equitable outcome of sort of achieving that overall university level persistence rate. And so what our models told us that for each kind of 1/10 of a point increase in that net cost ratio, it's 22% lower odds of persisting. So the extent to which we can kind of bump up some of this, the aid to these students, the more likely we are to kind of get them to persist. And I think because we have the numbers kind of figured out, I think we ended up coming up with, it was something like we would need an additional $3 million or so in aid in order to kind of get these two limited income and other need-based aid groups kind of get their net cost ratios back up to sort of that ideal net cost ratio that's going to kind of help us with, help retain them at a higher rate. The last today I kind of want to talk about is this NESI survey. So NESI is the National Survey of Student Engagement, and we do this fairly regularly every few years. There's a set module that we do. This one is a special module that we did called Inclusiveness and Engagement with Cultural Diversity here, and I can link that report for you if you wanted to take a look at that as well. So generally it's a confidential online survey. It's administered, it's a census administration to all first year and senior undergraduate students of all types. So that includes transfer students and online students. So it's not limited to that first time full-time cohort, which is often one of like just sort of our unit of analysis a lot of the time. So just be aware of that. There's also, we have a whole site for all of our NESI reporting that you can all take a look at if you're interested in looking at these reports. I think we had, let's see, it was about a 35% response rate to the survey off of that census. So it was about 1,800 first year students and about 2,100 seniors responded to this survey. So the inclusiveness and engagement module or diversity module, it kind of had 5 key themes that we looked at. There's like a coursework emphasis, institutional emphasis, supportive environment, sense of community, and that's sort of like your sense of belonging, I guess, and personal engagement with identity and diversity. And so these are like I would say these questions are probably have anywhere from 6 to 7 parts, and they ask individual items within those. And so we've sort of grouped these by theme here to kind of look at first year versus senior students across these overall themes. And so when I was looking at these data for Warner and kind of comparing it to the university overall, the Warner results tend to be higher or more favorable than what we see at the overall university level. And so, but I'm also not seeing really any big, I wouldn't call these very big differences between minoritized and non-minoritized. Again, I didn't do any statistical testing to see if any of these differences are statistically significant, but maybe here and that in the senior, the personal engagement, that there might be a difference here between the minoritized and non-minoritized students in terms of the extent to which they engaged in diversity activities. But that's really the only piece that's kind of that maybe is jumping out at me. Otherwise, I would say that we're seeing very similar responses from minoritized and non-minoritized students, whereas compared to CSU overall, the minoritized students at CSU tended to give slightly lower ratings than the non-minoritized students. So we're seeing a difference there that I'm not seeing here in Warner. So those are all the reports I've covered. Here are links to the, I think we can send this out later, links to the reports I talked about in the presentation, but also a list of other reports that institutional research has done that you might find of interest, that maybe we might want to spark some additional conversations. We might want to pull out some Warner specific data if you're interested. And so these are some of those reports. There's success gaps by duplicated race and ethnicity. There's the learning community report. So we do an overall report for the learning communities, and there's a special report just for Warner on the learning community. And it's interesting, now that I think about that learning community, I do recall that this last cohort of those students in that learning community, that fall 18 cohort, did exceptionally well in terms of their persistence. And I'm also wondering if maybe that may have fed into some of that jumps, that some of those increases that we saw early at the very beginning of that presentation. There's also a report we just did on working on campus on student success and the extent to which working has a positive association on retention rates. And I do believe that's sort of one thing that we found. There's kind of a sweet spot, I believe, in terms of the number of hours a student works that kind of helps with student success. And there's also summer session and student success. That's a pretty interesting report in terms of being able to leverage summer session as a way of helping with graduation rates. And I know there is a specific chart just for Warner. We kind of looked at the 4, 5, and 6 year graduation rates by students who enrolled in a summer session. And I think that that's an interesting report to look at, especially if we go back to that momentum year report and thinking about the completing 30 credits. If a student, can't complete those 30 credits in the fall and spring, maybe we can get into 30 credits by getting them to a summer session. And then lastly, we have some of those NESE reports, those student engagement surveys that we do at a national, every, I want to say 3 or 4 years, I want to say. And so there's a big report, and there's also one, we also did a special administration of an academic advising module earlier this year, and so those data are available as well. So there we go. That's all of my slides, so I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Lee. As I'm giving time for our participants, please add in your questions to the chat box. And if there's a particular slide, I'm sure Lee will go back to that slide if you have a particular question about a slide as well. So I'm just going to give everybody a couple seconds to kind of start putting in their questions in the chat box. The reason why we're keeping it in the chat box is, number one, that we can see it and Lee can read it at the same time, but also it'll be easy for those to read when we do this recording as well. So please do so as well. With that, thank you very much, Lee. I think, again, Warner, we've been through a lot of data presentations, and I think this one kind of shows a little bit more highlight of things that we've done well and that we're doing well, but things that we want to improve on and continue to show action behind are words of sentiments for our minoritized student population. So with that, I want to kind of ask 2 or 3 things, Lee, real quick, as I give people time, and then I'll make some remarks at the end. That very last slide you showed, it kind of showed these 3 areas of supportive community, sense of community, and then engagement from the student perspective. Do you see any other data points that suggest why there is a decrease with that? And then you made a point halfway with that, there's this balance of student employment engagement. Does that supplement engagement that we should offer within the college as they are persisting? So it seems like to me the data show that we're doing pretty well the first 2 years of getting them persisting, but then right around that second year, our numbers start to drop off. And I don't know if that's because there's this transition of them doing more things independently versus college programmatic or university programmatic efforts, or them balancing more work obligations outside of the classroom with what we offer as far as supportive programs.
I think those are some good questions, and I think it's probably maybe worth digging a little bit deeper into some of it. I think, part of it too, again, when I think back to the financial aid report and thinking about the student success, that was just the first year. That's just the amount of money a student gets at the first year. We kind of don't know what happens their second, third year and beyond. So that's actually one of sort of on my list of things that I would like to personally investigate more, sort of what does sort of ongoing financial aid look like for a student as they kind of progress, and where are we kind of seeing some holes. The thing about it's a really hard balance for students, especially when we think about sort of the summer. The summer oftentimes is where students they're not going to be on campus. This is where they kind of earn money during the summer to help pay for school in the fall. And I think, I've been working on some analysis on the CARES Act money, and part of that sort of students had to apply and say why they were applying for that money. And I can see in looking through a lot of those comments that students were like, I need this CARES Act money because now I don't have a summer job and I don't know how I'm going to pay for school in the fall. So there's a lot of stuff kind of coming around that's sort of hitting these students where the summer is a tough time for students in terms of how they make their money, how they pay for school. But there's also a lot of positive associations for students that if we can get them to come to summer session and earn some credits in the summer, they're much more likely to return in the fall. But a lot of students maybe can't come to the summer because they can't pay for school because they're earning money to pay for school in the fall. So I think there's a lot of thoughts that there's a lot of thinking that we kind of need to do around sort of the financial support of students, not just in the fall, but sort of as a year round, thinking about that and how we support them. I think, because I believe you have, there's the mountain campus for students. I mean, I wonder how much of a deterrent is that summer program in the mountain campus for students just financially, that if their summer is spent earning money to pay for the fall, how many students are kind of opting out of the college at some point because they simply can't afford to go to that summer, the mountain campus in the summer. So I don't really have an answer, just that I think there needs to be a lot of thinking around how we kind of support students academically, financially. And while a lot of times the focus might be in the fall for finances, it's a year-round issue for a lot of students.
Thank you for that answer. One of the questions that came in as you were providing that answer was from Tiara. You used minoritized and racially minoritized in your presentation. To clarify, what does minoritized consist of? Is it women, Pell recipients? What's the difference between these two terms?
So I kind of use them interchangeably. Minoritized, racially minoritized students of color, I tend to kind of use all of them as to sort of mean basically the same thing, and that's just basically the box you check on what is your race in those boxes. So when I say racially minoritized, that's going to include students who identify as Hispanic or Latinx, Black, Asian, Hawaiian, Native American. So it's going to include those groups. Sometimes in terms of a lot of those intersecting identities between like first generation Pell, racially minoritized, you might hear me refer to them as structurally underserved populations. And those are the three populations I tend to talk about. If I'm saying structurally underserved, those are the populations I'm referencing. And a lot of times they do sort of intersect. If you recall back to that one slide when we were looking at some of the financial aid, we had a line for the students who were first generation, racially minoritized, and also we showed the proportion who were both. And so I know at the university level and that lower income group, it was about 50% racially minoritized, 50% first generation, and about 36% were both. So we kind of see how those kind of groups intersect. And so a lot of times our reports, I don't necessarily only pull out racially minoritized. Sometimes what we'll do is we'll look at some of those intersecting identities of those students who have at least one of those attributes versus students who have two or more of those attributes. And then we can kind of see differences there as well.
Thank you for that answer. As you were doing this report, and participants, please feel free to provide any questions you might have. As you was doing this report, I know the question I asked you behind the scenes was to make this tailored to Warner. When you look at it from a macro lens, are there any data points or best practices or things that the data suggests positively that we should take in consideration that we might not have applied to us currently, that we should definitely think about?
Oh, that's a really good question. I come back to the summer. I come back to summer session as there's a lot of positive stuff happening for students if we can get them to come to summer session in terms of their persistence rates. I also think just, in general, the extent to which you can kind of just be supportive of students and understand sort of where they're coming from, especially during this time period now with the COVID crisis and everything that's going on. I think students are feeling really vulnerable right now. And so I see that a lot in sort of the comments, and they're not sure, they're really unsure, especially coming in this fall, coming into the fall term and sort of what it means for them and if they're even going to come back. So I think there's a lot to be said for just being communicative and supportive of these students and sort of kind of see where it goes. I think we're going to be doing some additional reporting, again, related to that CARES Act and some of that money that helped those students who requested some financial assistance for this summer. We're going to be doing some additional reporting to see, well, we gave these students some money. It's like, did they come back? Did that help with like some persistence rates? And so again, that goes back to also how do we financially support these students? There's a lot of support that these students need right now because this is unprecedented times.
Thank you for that. And our department head for Fish, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology shared that they're setting up an 8-week paid summer internship for our students attending the Mountain Campus, which provides them a job before or after they attend that course up there. So we are looking at those areas of ways to provide funding and also engagement throughout the summer term as well. So thank you for sharing those comments, Catherine. Another question, and if there's one more question, please bring that in, or this could be our last question. What do stories from racially minoritized and intersectionality minoritized themselves as well as, what do stories from racially minoritized and intersectionalized minoritized as well as qualitative scholarships on this topic tell us in combination with this quantitative data you shared today? Hopefully you understood what I just said.
I'm not sure. We don't have like a lot of qualitative data. The data that I have, we pull it from the system of record. So it comes from our sort of main databases. And and IR really doesn't do qualitative work. I do think that that type of work, though, can add a lot of information to these data and really can help enrich it. You know, we think about students and why they, you know, once a student leaves the university, like if they, you know, they drop out or they do a full university withdrawal, we don't know why. You know, we don't know why they do that, because I don't think we have I'm not aware of any data on it, but it would be good to know, because I think potentially the finances are probably a reason, but there's probably a lot of other reasons too that we just don't know.
Thank you, Lee. I'm sorry. I was trying to unmute myself. I don't know what's going on. There's some things here. Let's say there was a question. It says, I was a little bit confused on the emphasis of students reaching 30 credits in their first year. Can you explain again why that is important? I think some students take fewer credits because they want to succeed academically while also working 20 to 40 hours a week.
Yeah, I think what we saw there in that report was that the highest persistence rates for students were for those that completed at least 30 credits in their first year. So that's where that 30 credits kind of comes in. We didn't look at the hours worked. That wasn't kind of factored in. Again, we're just looking at these momentum year kind of criteria, and those criteria kind of are from that Complete College America. This is sort of their initiative, and so we're kind of joined in it, and we've done work on this before. And so that momentum year report that I was talking about was actually kind of like a follow-up to a report that we had done maybe 3 or 4 years prior. And so that 30 credits is sort of just like this benchmark, and if you think about it, that's, you know, roughly a full-time schedule. If you can do, well, slightly more than full-time, you know, 15 credits in the fall, 15 credits in the spring generally. But if you have to stretch it out to the summer, you could do, you know, you can make up those additional credits in the summer, potentially maybe doing 12 and 6 credits in the summer, for example, to get to that 30 credits. And so that's just where it comes from. It's just that we found the highest association of retention for students who completed 30 credits, either alone, just that 30 credits, or 30 credits in conjunction with a composition and math course. Does that answer your question? I know it's tough for some students, but that's sort of what we sort of saw within the data and what our modeling showed and what our observed data showed as well.
Yes, you answered her question, so good. So we have about 5 minutes left. I'm going to make my final announcements, and I'll give you all the last 30 seconds to share any comments. But thank you again, Lee, for taking this time to share this data with us. I think the emphasis that we want to show is that we here at Warner, we're trying to be committed and intentional in our actions and our accountability for each other. This was culminated with the town hall that we had a couple of weeks ago, following this, and then preceded by this presentation as well today. And so, you know, one thing that I want to share with anyone who's paying attention today on this training, and those who will chime in on the recording, is that, you know, Warner, we are striving to find ways to have better engagement with our students. Warner is going to be a part of a new initiative that's coming in the fall called United in STEM, which is creating a sense of belongingness of our minoritized students across all our STEM colleges. And so hopefully that's a way for their students to have community outside the classroom, engagement with other peers who are minoritized in other colleges, but also it creates a greater sense of community for those students, especially with Lee sharing that metrics of the math qualification or the math completion persistence. If there's a student of color that I connect with in engineering who's a little bit stronger in math than I am, and there's that connective community, then the likelihood of me studying with that individual will be increased. So we are having programmatic efforts that Warner is pursuing outside of the college or in addition to the college programmatic efforts to increase engagement. I want to remind everyone too as well that we were trying to, this past year, Jill Putman and Rich Conant's efforts to create a chemistry study study session, right, and tutoring session. And so we're trying to get the word out. So the call of action I have for everyone that's paying attention today is that as educators, as faculty members, as staff, it's us who needs to advertise the different things that we're doing so students are aware. Yes, the website will be helpful. Yes, my messaging consistently will kind of be a point of direction, but individually, each time we're in that classroom, sharing the resources that Warner has, sharing the programmatic efforts that we're partnering with, and then also being innovative within our communities, committees, department committees, and our D&I committees. Please do so in sharing your knowledge and sharing ways that we can always keep our students engaged. And then also understanding, based off of Lee's data today, having a balance with the understanding that some of these students have financial needs and they need to work. So how can we keep them employed or financially stable while still pursuing their academic progression as well? So with that, I want to say thank you for everyone to come. I will want, again, for those who are not aware of, and I'm going to put this in the link now, in the chat now, for those who are not aware, and if you are not a part of your department's diversity and inclusion committee, or if you're interested in being a part of the college-wide council, I invite you now to look at the website that we have that shows how to get in contact and be a part of that. So we can have a collective effort, because change does not come through one individual, it comes through a community. And so these are just the building blocks that we're having to institute change, because if each one of us make a degree of change, then collectively we made a whole lot of change as a college. And so again, please look at the website. I just put it in the chat for you all as ways to be involved. Email me at any time for any kind of suggestions or ideas that you may have. But let's continue to use this data that we have, data that we've heard before, new points, new perspectives of the data that we know is getting ready to come, and that I'm going to constantly invite. Like, I'll bring Lee back again in the spring if there's any updates, or whoever else to share any updates. But as we're getting this information, let's look at that information and let's use this data points as measurable progress. But then also, going back to what was stated in the chat, let's find ways to hear the qualitative side too, so that we can not only see the change in the metrics, but we can hear the change in the testimonies of our Warner affiliates as well. So thank you all for your commitment to this effort and to this work that Warner is doing to be not only a thought leader within the college with diversity and inclusion, but a thought leader nationally when it comes to natural resources and how that is important, how the aspect of diversity and inclusion is important when it comes to natural resource fields. So thank you all for presenting, and I mean not presenting, but being present today and taking time to learn from this. And again, I invite any kind of questions or comments, email to me or directly to Lee. Lee, I don't know if you put your email in there, but if you could, you can always have questions there too. So thank you again for taking your time out. And with that, this is the end. Have a good day.
Thank you.